I was brushing my teeth when the sink gurgled, hissed, and then coughed up a foul brown sludge like it was possessed. I spat into the mess, gagged, and heard a distant honk from outside. I bolted out the front door in my slippers and bathrobe, just in time to see the septic truck backing out of the HOA gate, its driver shrugging at me helplessly while Karen, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, stood in front of the service gate with a smug grin and a neon vest 2 sizes too small. She waved a laminated rulebook at me like it was a holy relic, yelling about unapproved service vehicles and community image while my drains were literally rebelling inside my house. I tried to speak, but she cut me off mid-sentence with the grace of a banshee crossed with a traffic cop. That's when I knew something deep, dark, and truly disgusting was about to go down, because if she thought denying me basic sanitation was just another HOA flex, she was about to learn what real backflow looked like. It hadn't always been like this. When I bought my home at the edge of Maple Hollow Estates, it was peaceful. Tucked between rows of perfect suburban lawns and Pinterest-inspired mailboxes, my lot had one extra detail that made it unique. I was just outside the city sewer grid. My place ran on a self-contained septic system, completely up to code, approved, and regulated. No one cared. At least, not until Karen got elected HOA president last fall and declared war on anything that ruined community symmetry. That apparently included me, my trucks, my solar panels, my motion sensor lights, and my quiet, odorless septic system that had been running smoothly for 5 years. Her vendetta was personal. And stupid. The first time she left a note taped to my door, it was about my grass being uneven. The second time, it was my untrimmed hedge corners. By the third, she'd taken photos of my septic truck parked out front during a regular pump-out and emailed them to the board claiming I was spilling toxic waste. That was the beginning of her crusade. The HOA, which had never bothered me before, suddenly started citing obscure bylaws and demanding I reroute my system through the non-existent public sewage. I showed them permits. I showed them the county exemption. They didn't care. Karen was on a mission. I had scheduled my regular tank pump for Tuesday morning, like I did every 3 months. The same driver, Bill, had come for years and always used the same side service gate. But this time, Karen had other plans. She had the gate padlocked and had posted a new sign reading, "No utility vehicles permitted without 14-day notice." It was taped with glitter stickers like it was a kindergarten project. When Bill arrived, she stood in front of his truck, recording with her phone like she was about to post the confrontation to TikTok. He tried to reason with her, said it would take 20 minutes max, but she stood her ground. Bill called me, apologizing as he drove away. That's when I ran outside and witnessed the mess. By then, the sludge had begun to back up into my shower. I turned off every drain, shut off the water, and knew that I had maybe 12 hours before things got real. Karen, meanwhile, acted like she had won a moral victory. That afternoon, she posted in the community group chat something like, "Pleased to report I stopped an unlicensed hazardous truck from entering our neighborhood. Thank you to the HOA for supporting beauty and order." She followed it with a dozen emojis of trees, hearts, and water droplets. I replied with a single sentence, "That truck prevents your beauty and order from becoming a septic disaster." She deleted my comment and blocked me. I tried calling the HOA's emergency contact number. No answer. I emailed. Nothing. I even walked to the clubhouse myself to speak to someone in person, but it was locked for some exclusive yoga retreat that Karen had organized. Residents were walking in and out with their mats, cucumber water, and smug glances. I stood there in my work boots, drenched in stress and a bit of panic, while Karen walked past me in her Lululemons and whispered, "You should have filed a form. Rules are rules." Back home, I opened my septic app and saw the tank levels climbing past 90%. The alarms were set. Legally, if it reached capacity, I was allowed to initiate a permitted overflow release. Something every septic system is built for in emergencies. But here's the kicker. The overflow was tied into a shared line that, while rarely used, connected indirectly to the drainage system beneath the HOA's beloved clubhouse. It was a last resort feature, one I had never triggered. But if I couldn't get a truck in and Karen wouldn't budge, that line would have to carry the load. Literally. I stayed up late that night, checking valves and confirming my legal documents were up to date. I even called my county inspector to report the blockage and left a voicemail documenting every move I had made. I wasn't going to let them pin this on me when the time came. I knew how HOA politics worked. One bad smell and I'd be labeled the villain. Around midnight, I heard a strange noise from my basement. It wasn't the alarm, it was the sound of air burbling up through the pipes, the kind of noise that says, "Hey buddy, your house is about to become the set of a disaster movie." I paced the floor, weighing my options. I could drive my truck through the gate myself and break the lock, but that would give Karen ammo. Or I could wait and let the system do what it was designed to do, shift the waste somewhere that wasn't my living room. At 6:45 the next morning, I got a text from a neighbor. It was a photo. The caption read, "Is the clubhouse sprinkler system broken or?" The image showed brown liquid seeping through the lawn, the walkway, even oozing from beneath the clubhouse doors. It had begun. And Karen? She had just arrived to host a brunch. I made coffee and sat down at my window with a notepad. Because if they were going to blame me, I was going to be prepared. I had copies of everything. What Karen didn't know yet was that this mess, this actual sewage catastrophe, was 100% traceable to her own ridiculous rules. And I was going to make sure everyone saw it for what it was, the consequence of arrogance clogging up common sense. Karen stood in the middle of the clubhouse parking lot, dressed in a pristine white blouse and beige slacks, frozen in horror as the stench hit her like a freight train. Brown water bubbled from the foundation cracks, the tiled floor inside now hidden under a swamp of raw sewage. Her brunch guests, mostly elderly HOA members and a few local socialites, screamed as they backed away from the building. One woman lost a heel in the mulch trying to run. Another man held a handkerchief to his face and asked if the lake had exploded. Karen, clinging desperately to her clipboard, shouted orders to no one in particular, blaming a mysterious system failure and demanding the maintenance team fix it. There was just one small issue. The clubhouse didn't have a maintenance team. It never had. Karen had voted down that budget in favor of flower beds and fake security cameras. Meanwhile, I sat on my porch sipping coffee, watching the chaos unfold through binoculars. It wasn't satisfaction I felt. It was vindication. I had warned them. I had documented every denial, every locked gate, every ignored email. But now, the thing they feared most, the very image Karen had tried so hard to avoid, was here. And it wasn't in my yard. It was all over theirs. I'd already received 3 texts from neighbors by sunrise. One simply read, "It's everywhere." Another said, "Karen looks like she's about to puke." And the third was a video of Karen trying to use an umbrella to shield herself as a geyser shot from a storm drained 6 feet in the air, splattering her car. A county inspector named Lucas finally arrived just after 9 a.m. He was a no-nonsense guy with a clipboard, a GoPro strapped to his vest, and a reputation for not taking excuses. I had spoken with him on the phone the night before and forwarded him all my logs and messages. As he walked into the clubhouse disaster site, he was already shaking his head. Karen met him at the sidewalk, waving her hands wildly, trying to point fingers in every direction. I saw her gesture toward my house, then up at the power lines, and then into the sky like she was blaming the weather itself. Lucas just nodded politely, then walked to the side of the building, found the backflow hatch, opened it, and whistled. What he saw was enough. The overflow line from my septic system, properly documented, had released its contents into the shared drain after the HOA blocked my scheduled pump-out. It was all there, in the logbook. Legally released, documented in the county records, with automatic sensors showing exactly when and how much. My hands were clean. Figuratively, anyway. Karen's face turned the same shade as the sludge coating the curb. Her voice, once so shrill and confident, cracked as she tried to explain how my septic truck was unauthorized and that she was enforcing community standards. Lucas cut her off mid-rant with a single sentence that sent the entire HOA board into a stunned silence. "Ma'am, you actively obstructed critical infrastructure. That's a violation of both county and environmental codes." The silence was so loud you could hear the sprinkler system humming. One of the board members, a frail man named Dennis, let out a nervous cough and tried to sneak away toward his golf cart, only to slip on a wet patch and fall directly into the mulch. Nobody helped him. By mid-morning, the clubhouse was cordoned off with yellow tape, and a hazmat team had been dispatched to assess the damage. News vans showed up after a reporter spotted viral videos online, some with titles like "HOA Queen Sinks in Sewage" and "When You Cancel the Septic Truck, But Karma Doesn't Cancel You." Karen tried to block the reporters, but she ended up with a microphone in her face, and a lens zoomed in on the growing stain on her pants where she had accidentally stepped backward into a puddle. The footage hit local television by noon. My phone didn't stop buzzing. I spent most of the day staying quiet, watching from a distance, letting the events speak for themselves. But I wasn't entirely passive. I made a visit to the HOA office around 2 p.m., carrying a thick folder of documents. A few residents were already gathered outside, some furious, some laughing, some just confused. I walked through the crowd and calmly knocked on the glass door, which now had a sign taped to it that read, "Closed for emergency maintenance." One of the junior board members, a woman named Trish who'd never liked Karen much to begin with, opened the door and let me in with a whisper. "You better come in. It's a war zone." Inside, the mood was tense. Karen was pacing, red-faced, barking at her phone while the treasurer and secretary sat quietly at the conference table, looking like they wanted to be anywhere else. I dropped the folder onto the table and slid it forward. "That's everything. Communication logs, septic reports, video timestamp, legal permit, county approvals, the whole thing. I suggest you read it carefully before trying to pin this on me." Karen stopped mid-sentence, spun toward me and snapped, "You think you're so clever, don't you?" I smiled and replied, "No. I just think plumbing is important." She lunged for the folder but didn't open it. She turned back to the board and started into another rant about community values and neighborhood aesthetics, but this time the treasurer, Harold, finally spoke up. "Karen, we're not defending you on this one. You crossed a line. A literal one." The secretary nodded. "You didn't just block the truck. You locked a gate during a service window and lied about it in the report." Karen's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, like a fish gasping in dirty water. I turned and walked out, leaving the stench of panic behind me. Outside, residents had started setting up folding chairs. Someone brought popcorn. The clubhouse lawn had become a front-row seat to the crumbling regime. One of my neighbors gave me a high five as I passed. Another asked if I had an extra copy of the report to read. I offered to email it. By 5 p.m., an emergency HOA meeting was called. Not in the clubhouse, but in the parking lot, under a hastily erected canopy. Karen showed up late, disheveled and exhausted, clutching her purse like it was the last vestige of her authority. She tried to start the meeting, but the crowd wasn't having it. People booed. Others laughed. Someone held up a sign that said, "Flush Karen." What followed wasn't just a community meeting. It was an uprising. Resident after resident stood up to voice their complaints, not just about the sewage, but about everything. The absurd fines, the random inspections, the vendettas, the arrogance. It was like a volcano had erupted, and the lava was made of pent-up frustration and passive-aggressive emails. Karen tried to regain control, but it was too late. The HOA board, under pressure, agreed to schedule a vote of no confidence within the week. Karen stormed off before the meeting ended, stepping over the caution tape around the clubhouse as if refusing to acknowledge it still existed. That night, I sat on my back porch and looked out over the neighborhood. The moonlight reflected off the drying pavement where the mess had started. It was quiet now, Phil. Like the air itself had changed. Not because people were scared, but because they were finally ready to stand up. And for once, I didn't feel like the outsider with the septic system. I felt like the guy who reminded everyone what happens when you try to control everything and forget to respect the pipes. The next morning, the clubhouse stood as a cautionary monument to arrogance. The hazmat team had spent hours trying to mitigate the damage, but even their heavy-duty gear couldn't disguise the reality. The foundation was compromised, the flooring warped beyond repair, and the air inside was thick with a lingering stench that no industrial fan could fix. Most of the board members refused to even go near the site. They met instead in makeshift spaces, someone's garage, a folding table under a pop-up tent, or in Karen's case, the back seat of her SUV where she could pretend the world hadn't seen her splattered in wastewater on local TV. Karen was unraveling. She was still technically HOA president, but after the public humiliation and the emergency vote scheduled for Friday, she clung to the title like it was a life vest on a sinking cruise ship. She sent out panicked emails to residents, thinly veiled as updates, accusing unnamed individuals of sabotage, improper system installation, and malicious intent. She tried to rally support, claiming the septic overflow was part of a conspiracy to discredit her leadership. But the problem was no one believed her anymore. She had cried HOA wolf too many times, and now that the neighborhood had literally flooded with her failure, no one wanted to hear another excuse. At noon, I received a letter in my mailbox, hand-delivered, not mailed. It was a formal HOA violation citing me for improper waste disposal endangering communal property. The irony was so thick I almost laughed. Attached to it was a printout of a grainy photo of my septic control panel, which could have only been taken by someone peeking over my fence. At the bottom of the letter was Karen's signature in thick blue ink, underlined twice like a threat. I walked straight inside, pulled up my camera footage, and sure enough, there she was at 5:46 a.m. standing on a garden stool with a phone held high trying to take photos through my backyard trellis. That footage was going straight into my growing file. It was becoming clear that Karen wasn't just panicked, she was on the edge of spiraling into something worse. Around the same time, I noticed my neighbor Paul standing by his truck, holding a box of tools and a confused expression. He waved me over and pointed to a new sign Karen had apparently installed overnight near the community's east gate. It read, "Authorized personnel only. Service vehicles must check in with HOA president." Paul scratched his head and muttered that he had lived here for 16 years, and no one had ever had to check in for plumbing work. Now, thanks to Karen's desperation to maintain control, his repair guy had been turned away at the gate. I could see the frustration boiling over. It wasn't just me anymore. She had begun applying her chaos to everyone. That evening, a small crowd gathered in front of the temporary HOA meeting tent. Some brought lawn chairs. Others brought documentation. A few brought wine. It had a strange, picnic-like feel, except the air was thick with tension. Karen arrived late, wearing oversized sunglasses and a silk scarf like she was trying to escape paparazzi. She didn't look at anyone as she marched to the center table and shuffled her notes. As she began reading from a typed statement filled with passive-aggressive half-apologies, residents began pulling out their phones. Every word she said was recorded. Then Trish stood up. The quiet, mild-mannered board member who had once let Karen walk all over her cleared her throat and said, "Enough. You tried to hide a sewage disaster by blaming the person who warned you about it. We have his permit. We have his emails. We have your texts." She held up her phone. "I think the community deserves to see what real leadership looks like. And this isn't it." A murmur ran through the crowd, followed by a few claps. Karen's face tightened. She snapped that this was a smear campaign, that there were rules and order, and if she didn't enforce them, who would? But by then, even her allies had gone silent. Dennis the treasurer raised his hand and said softly, "Karen, it's over. People are angry. People are scared. And frankly, you've turned this place into a circus." That was when the questions began. One by one, residents stood and shared their stories. A retired couple talked about being fined for wind chimes. A single mom revealed she was harassed for having her son's bike in the front yard. A disabled vet explained how his home modifications had been deemed visually disruptive. By the time the fifth story ended, Karen looked smaller than she ever had. Her voice was gone. She stood there, silent, swallowing whatever rage or shame was left. She didn't speak again for the rest of the meeting. Trish took over, outlining the process for the no-confidence vote, including how ballots would be distributed, verified, and counted. It was all above board, clean. Unlike the clubhouse, no one tried to stop it. Later that night, I received a call from Lucas, the county inspector. He thanked me for cooperating and said his report would be finalized in the morning. He confirmed that Karen's obstruction of a scheduled waste service was not only in violation of HOA protocols but also municipal code. He explained that while I had followed the legal overflow procedure to the letter, Karen's actions had rendered the HOA liable for all resulting damages, including the estimated tens of thousands of dollars in structural repairs. "They'll probably try to pin it on insurance," he said. "But good luck explaining that to the underwriter with video evidence of the HOA president padlocking the gate." I could practically hear him smiling. That was the moment I decided to finalize my packet. Everything I had gathered, videos, emails, photos, timestamps, went into a compressed folder I named Operation Flushback. I printed summaries for the board and made flash drives for anyone who wanted one. I didn't have to attack Karen. The facts did it for me. The next morning, my doorbell rang. It was a group of neighbors, some I barely knew, holding cups of coffee and boxes of donut. One of them, Greg from 2 streets over, handed me a thank you card. "For standing up to her," he said. "You didn't just protect your house. You stood up for all of us." I invited them in, not for revenge or celebration, but because for the first time in a while, I felt like we were actually a community again, one no longer afraid of getting a passive-aggressive letter for leaving the trash bin out too long. As we talked, more people stopped by. We made a plan to help clean the East Service Road, which Karen had let fall into disrepair. Someone offered to host the next meeting at their house. Another person, Linda, who worked in city records, offered to help the HOA draft better guidelines for property exceptions. Real leadership was forming, organic, cooperative, and focused on people rather than power. That night, I sat alone on my porch again, this time watching the tent sway gently in the breeze. The moon was bright. The air finally smelled clean. Somewhere in the distance, a toilet flushed. And for once, I knew it would stay where it belonged. The sun rose the next day over Maple Hollow Estates with an eerie calmness, the kind that follows a storm not of wind and rain but of ego, sewage, and broken trust. The yellow caution tape still fluttered around the condemned clubhouse like a crime scene, which in a way it was. It wasn't just about a septic flood anymore. That was merely the flashpoint. This had become about the absolute unraveling of an illusion, the illusion that the HOA was functioning in the interest of the community. In truth, it had become Karen's playground, and now the entire neighborhood was waking up to the reality of what they had allowed to fester. The previous night's emergency meeting had set the stage for change, but the aftermath was more than just political, it was personal. Karen hadn't been seen that morning. Her blinds remained drawn, and the once overly decorated front porch that boasted seasonal wreaths and matching flower pots now looked abandoned. The rumor mill, always alive in Maple Hollow, had kicked into overdrive. Some said she was on the phone with lawyers. Others whispered that she was trying to scrub her social media accounts clean of all her HOA-related posts. A few residents claimed they saw a moving truck circling the block late at night, but no one could confirm it. What was confirmed was this: she had lost the room, and everyone knew it. Trish, the interim head until the vote, wasted no time. She organized a walkthrough of the community with a few volunteers to assess the real state of the neighborhood. I joined, along with Greg, Linda, and Paul. We walked through sidewalks overgrown with weeds, faded signs that hadn't been replaced in years, cracked curbs that were painted over instead of fixed, and piles of HOA citations stacked on doors like junk mail. For a group that claimed to care about aesthetics and order, the actual maintenance of the neighborhood had been quietly ignored in favor of Karen's obsession with enforcing power. And everyone saw it now, not just those of us who had clashed with her before. There was a collective realization dawning on people that their homes, their community, had been managed through fear and vanity, not responsibility. When we reached the clubhouse, Lucas, the county inspector, was already there with the restoration team. They were assessing whether the building could even be salvaged. He greeted us with a nod and said grimly, "The foundation's taken too much damage. Even with repairs, the plumbing system underneath is compromised. You'd be safer starting over." That comment hit everyone hard. The clubhouse wasn't just a building, it was where block parties were held, baby showers, graduation celebrations, and more. Karen's mismanagement had poisoned more than the pipe. She had flushed away something symbolic, something communal. That night, I received another knock at my door. This time it was a teenager named Ethan, holding a small envelope and looking sheepish. I recognized him from a few houses down, the quiet type, always fixing something on his skateboard in the driveway. He handed me the envelope and said, "This is from my mom. She said to give it to the guy who stopped the HOA from going completely insane." He offered a lopsided grin and turned to leave before I could ask anything. Inside the envelope was a handwritten thank you note and a $10 Starbucks gift card. I laughed at the gesture but felt the sincerity in every word she wrote. I hadn't realized how far Karen's reach had stretched until people started coming out of the woodwork to say thank you. The next morning, the ballots were distributed. Each home received a sealed envelope with a simple yes or no question. Should the current HOA president, Karen Hutchins, be removed from office effective immediately? It was official, procedural, and exactly what was needed. I watched as neighbors walked to the temporary drop box, some with purpose, some with a kind of relief. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming sanity. The tension across the neighborhood was thick, but under it was something else: unity. The kind that only forms when people realize they've all been carrying the same weight alone and finally decide to carry it together. Karen must have realized it too, because that afternoon she resurfaced, marching to the drop box with her signature clipboard and a printed statement she taped to the community board. It was 4 paragraphs of defiance, deflection, and declarations of innocence. She claimed she had done everything by the book, that she had only acted to protect property values and uphold standard. She didn't apologize. She didn't admit fault. She didn't even acknowledge the footage of her standing on a stool peeking into my yard. But no one tore the statement down. No one argued with her. No one even responded. Because at that point, no one needed to. Her words were powerless. The vote count was scheduled for the following evening. The temporary HOA tent was lit up with borrowed string lights, and the folding tables had been wiped down. Trish, Paul, and 2 other residents supervised the count. Everything was transparent, from the ballot verification to the final tally. When Trish read the results aloud, 136 votes for removal, 8 against. The silence that followed was thick with closure. There was no cheering, no celebration, just a slow collective exhale. Karen, who had been watching from a distance in her parked car, didn't come out. She turned on the engine and drove off without a word. It was over. But the story didn't end there. The HOA had a lot of rebuilding to do. Physically, yes, but more importantly, in trust. The new board, including Trish, Linda, and Greg, began drafting reforms. They opened communication channels, created an online portal for feedback, and started monthly town hall meetings. More volunteers stepped forward than expected. People who had never spoken at meetings before now brought ideas and solutions. The atmosphere was changing. Instead of fines and threats, there were flyers for cleanup days and suggestions for improving the walking trail. It was the same neighborhood, but it felt new. One Saturday, we organized a community workday to remove the caution tape and begin dismantling the damaged clubhouse. As we pried up floorboards and cleared out debris, someone found an old box tucked behind a cabinet. Inside were years of Karen's saved documents, complaints, photos, citations, and scribbled note. There were even complaint drafts she'd never sent, including one about a dog that barked too cheerfully and a lawn she described as too aggressively green. We passed the box around, and for the first time, people laughed. Genuinely laughed. It was therapeutic. That evening, we stood in the clearing where the clubhouse once was. Someone set up a projector and played a movie against a white bedsheet. Kids sat on blankets, neighbors shared snacks, and for a few hours, we were just people enjoying where we lived. No rules. No inspections. Just a community. As I sat watching the screen, I thought back to the moment I saw my sink spit up sludge. At the time, it felt like the beginning of a nightmare. But looking around now, it felt more like the start of something necessary. Sometimes it takes a mess to reveal the crack, and sometimes those cracks are where light finally gets in. The morning after the vote, the neighborhood didn't just look different, it felt different. The tightness that had gripped Maple Hollow for the past year had finally loosened, as though the whole block had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. For once, there wasn't a single passive-aggressive note stuck to a mailbox. No HOA patrol cars circling like vultures, no awkward sideways glances from neighbors afraid to be caught talking to the wrong people. The clubhouse site remained roped off, a gutted shell of its former self, but the chaos it once symbolized was gone. In its place was something far more valuable, a community reclaiming itself. Overnight, Karen's house had gone dark. The porch lights, once programmed to glow with military precision, remained off. Her security cameras, once pointed toward every possible angle of the street, had been taken down. A moving truck finally arrived around mid-morning, backed in quietly and began the slow process of loading boxes. No fanfare. No confrontation. She didn't say goodbye, didn't issue one last decree, didn't even slam the door on the way out. One of the workers muttered that she'd already flown to her sister's house upstate and was having them pack the rest. No one came to wave her off. No one needed to. It would have been easy to say good riddance and leave it at that, but strangely, I didn't feel anger anymore. What I felt was something deeper, exhaustion, maybe even pity. Karen had built her identity around control, and now that it had slipped through her fingers, she had nothing left to stand on. Her name would probably come up for a few weeks in whispered stories and cautious jokes, but eventually she'd fade into the rearview, just another cautionary tale in HOA history. Meanwhile, the new board got to work, and they didn't waste a second. Trish and Linda organized a roundtable discussion that Saturday to draft the first round of reforms. They invited every resident to show up and speak freely. There were no clocks, no limits, no threats of fines if someone went a minute over. People brought folding chairs, not complaints. Some even brought cookies and drinks. It was informal but energized. For once, the people steering the community were actually listening. One of the first suggestions was the creation of a common-sense exception clause for homeowners with unique setups, like my septic system. That clause passed unanimously. Another neighbor proposed a rotating community cleanup schedule, where different blocks could host gardening days or beautification events. Even the kids joined in, proposing a monthly, no-chores zone, where the park would be left wild for games and exploration. Trish, smiling at their enthusiasm, promised they'd make it happen. The biggest shift, though, was how people talked to one another. For the first time, folks weren't speaking through citations or anonymous complaint forms. They were having real conversations, even disagreements, without fear of being targeted. Greg, who had lived here for a decade and once considered moving out because of the HOA pressure, stood up and said, "I used to feel like I lived in a museum. You could walk around, but God forbid you touched anything. Now, it feels like we're allowed to breathe again." Everyone clapped, and it wasn't performative. It was real. As for me, I kept my head down at first, watching from the side. I didn't want to become some kind of symbol or celebrity for what happened. I hadn't done anything extraordinary, I just stood my ground when it counted. But people kept approaching me. They'd say things like, "Thanks for sticking with it," or, "I thought I was the only one going crazy." Even people who'd once stayed silent during Karen's rule now shared their own stories of intimidation and overreach. Turns out, the problem had been much bigger than anyone realized. It just took one very public mess to flush it out. Lucas, the county inspector, sent a final report to the board along with a courtesy copy to me. In it, he detailed the sequence of failures, the ignored warnings, the locked gate, the legal overflow, and the chain of causality that made the clubhouse disaster inevitable. He closed his report with a note: "No further action recommended against homeowner. Incident caused solely by obstruction of routine sanitation service." That single sentence cleared my name not just on paper, but in the minds of every resident who might have once believed Karen's smear campaign. But the best moment came a week later when I walked into my yard to find a package sitting at my doorstep. It was wrapped in brown paper with no return address. I opened it cautiously, half expecting another violation notice, but inside was a pristine golden toilet seat, engraved with the words, "The HOA Throne of Truth." A little note was tucked beside it, "For the man who kept the crap flowing in the right direction." No one ever confessed to sending it, but I had my suspicions. I bolted it to the wall of my garage, right above my workbench where it still hangs like a trophy. That same weekend, we held a neighborhood picnic on the green space near the old clubhouse site. It was the first time in over a year that people gathered just for the sake of fun, without a dress code, without a lecture, and without being told where they could or couldn't park. Trish brought a grill, Paul brought a speaker system, and someone set up a slip-and-slide for the kids. Even the dogs ran around without getting glared at. People talked, laughed, and shared stories not just about what went wrong, but what they wanted to make right. There was a sense of rebuilding, not just with brick and mortar, but with trust. We all knew there was still work to be done. The clubhouse would have to be demolished and eventually replaced. Budgets would need to be rewritten, contractors vetted, policies updated. But the foundation we were building now was stronger than concrete. It was built on transparency, participation, and shared responsibility. And best of all, it didn't smell like sewage. Late that evening, as the last embers from the grill burned low and neighbors packed up their chairs, I sat on the back of my truck bed with a drink in hand, just watching. Watching kids chase fireflies. Watching parents share wine under string lights. Watching what looked like the rebirth of a neighborhood that had nearly collapsed under the weight of one woman's obsession with power. I couldn't help but smile. What started with a blocked septic truck had evolved into something far greater. Karen's attempts to control, to suppress, to dictate had instead united people. The real mess wasn't what spilled into the clubhouse. It was what had built up for years behind closed doors, sealed off by fear and silence. And now that it was out in the open, the cleanup wasn't just possible. It was already happening. As I climbed down and walked back toward my house, I passed a few residents still chatting by the sidewalk. They waved and I waved back. No tension. No side eyes. Just neighbors. Regular people. That night, I opened my windows for the first time in weeks. The breeze was cool, the air clean, and the silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was peaceful. For the first time since the saga began, there were no alarms going off. No septic backups. No laminated rulebooks shoved in my face. Just the quiet confidence that the worst had passed and better days were finally ahead. And if anyone ever needed a reminder of how far we'd come, they'd only have to look at the golden toilet seat mounted in my garage. A perfect tribute to the battle we never thought we'd fight, but somehow managed to win. Together,